Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 116, Moscow Ascending. Before we begin, I'd like to thank some new members, Sigurd, Annika, Kenny, Jana, Vivek, and Wojtek. Your support is much appreciated. You've probably heard at some point an explanation for the rise of Moscow that goes along the lines of, with Moscow backing, Moscow rose to dominate Rus, or Moscow was a tiny, insignificant town, and then the Mongols appointed its knyaz to collect their taxes. It's very common, and it's often used to imply a variety of things, that Moscow's success was due to outside intervention, or accidental, and therefore somehow less legitimate, that those outside forces were Asian, and therefore Moscow is not really European, with centuries of accumulated racialized prejudice behind that implication. Over the last couple of dozen episodes, we've seen that this was not true. It's true that over the Mongol period, Moscow rose from a small town to a small city and managed to secure the title of Grand Knyaz, not exclusively, but more often than others. But it would be a stretch to describe these things as dependent on the Mongols, and completely wrong to say that this alone had been the deciding factor that put Moscow in any kind of dominant position. The Mongols did not just pick who they were giving their Yarliks to. Over the 2 centuries of their rule, they never picked anyone who was not a Rurikid with a valid claim to the title. They were operating within the existing Rus system, giving approval, not choosing for themselves. Their choice was based on the candidates, each with a valid claim, persuading the Khan that he was the best option. They used negotiation, money, personal risks, sometimes friendship. The Yarlik was a reward for this work, but it did not automatically transform the holder into a powerful ruler or guarantee Mongol backing, whatever they were doing. There were several occasions on which the Khan gave or tried to give the Yarlik to someone other than Moscow. These decisions were not turning points that permanently redirected the fate of northeastern Rus. If the Yarlik had conferred decisive military and administrative control, transferring it away from Moscow should have impacted Moscow's position. It did not, because the knyazes were making their own fates. The Mongols backed the Grand Knyaz when it was necessary to collect their tribute, less frequently against foreign threats. They sometimes brought their armies into the northeast, but they did so for their own aims, not to settle princely disputes. They did not give Moscow Mongol armies to subjugate the other knyazes or to expand their territories. The title of Grand Knyaz had more prestige than practical governing power. As it had for centuries, it confirmed that the holder was recognized as the senior knyaz, not as the monarch of a unified state. The Grand Knyaz, as had been tradition since the early days of Rus, could call on the other knyazes to provide forces to fight wars with foreigners, but he could not tell them what to do. Each knyaz ruled his own knyazstva as his own kingdom, with his own court, revenues, and interests. Two other factors contributed much more than Mongol backing. First was Moscow's success in becoming the principal residence of the Metropolitan, the head of the Orthodox Church in Rus. This gave Moscow a degree of ecclesiastical prestige that no Yarlik could provide. The Metropolitan's presence brought clergy, scribes, visitors, wealth, diplomatic contacts, and symbolic authority. It allowed Moscow's rulers increasingly to present their city as the religious center of the Rus lands. This development was not imposed by the Mongols. It arose from the relationship between Moscow's knyazes and the Metropolitanate. The Metropolitan was an independent political figure whose support had to be cultivated. Retaining the Metropolitanate was therefore a genuine Muscovite achievement. As I'm forced to note from time to time, we get little information on the personality of many of these figures, but the knyazes retained the loyalty of the Metropolitans across generations, including times in which Moscow was weaker than its rivals. That says something about their skill. The second advantage was that Moscow avoided the extreme dynastic fragmentation that weakened many of its rivals. This was partly the result of policy, to be sure, but mostly it was luck. For several generations, Moscow's knyazes simply did not leave enough surviving sons to divide the knyazhestvo into an unmanageable collection of appanages. Elsewhere, normal Rurikid inheritance practices repeatedly weakened rival knyazhestva, dividing them among new branches, each with its own territory and ambitions. Moscow was not immune to this danger, as we saw in the Civil War, but for a crucial period it suffered less fragmentation than several of its competitors. These advantages helped Moscow survive disasters, recover from defeats, and remain a contender for the title of Grand Knyaz. They did not make it the ruler of Rus. When the Great Horde began its final fragmentation, Moscow was still relatively small. Lithuania was the largest and strongest state competing for the political inheritance of Rus. It controlled most western and southern Rus lands, possessed far greater resources, and had produced rulers of the stature of Jogaila and Vytautas. Moscow had done very well in occasionally desperate circumstances to keep control of the church and the title of Grand Knyaz, but even after Dmitry Donskoy's great victory over the Mongols, it had not been able to make itself the clear leader, keep Novgorod in line, or secure the loyalty of the other knyazhestva. Rather than the Mongols being the explanation for how Moscow rose to become Russia, it is the collapse of the Great Horde that gave Moscow the opportunity to do so. When Vasily II took the throne as the Great Horde was falling apart, it was in no way inevitable that this would happen. He was very much under Vytautas' sway, had lost all of his father's influence over the other knyazes, and soon looked like he was going to lose everything in a civil war. Tver was independent and in an alliance with Lithuania. Novgorod still played everybody off against everybody else to pursue its own interests, and if anyone expected any major changes to the status quo, they were probably expecting Lithuania to finally succeed in its long-term ambitions for eastward expansion. There were numerous points at which things could have gone very differently. If Toktamish and Vytautas had not lost at the Vorskla, if Novgorod had been less concerned about playing Moscow and Lithuania off against each other and had made a proper alliance with either one of them, if Lithuania had decided to fully back Tver during the Moscow Civil War, if Lithuania had decided to convert to Orthodoxy instead of Catholicism, would the Metropolitan have stayed in Moscow? Or would he have moved to what would have been the most powerful Orthodox kingdom of the day? Or if Lithuania had succeeded in establishing its own metropolitan, how much influence would Moscow have lost? Alternative histories are fun to consider, but of course we can never know how things would have turned out if someone did something differently. My point is, it was not Mongol backing that made Moscow and was responsible for the emergence of Russia. We've been through essentially the whole of the Mongol period, and Moscow has only now reached a position where it genuinely has influence over the rest of the Kняжество. It was the civil war in Moscow that finally changed Moscow into a place that had all the prerequisites for achieving regional dominance. This was not due to the Tatars intervening in the war. The Great Horde was finally and irreversibly splitting right at that time. It was down to Vasily II, who overcame military weakness, assassination attempts, being deposed, blinded, and captured by the Tatars, to end his reign as clearly the strongest Grand Knyaz since the Mongol invasion, maybe since the beginning of Rus altogether. Vasily's son, Ivan, served as co-ruler and then regent for his blind father, before becoming Grand Knyaz in 1462. He was the first Grand Knyaz of Moscow to take the throne who realistically inherited the resources to establish genuine supremacy over the whole northeast. He also had the patience, ruthlessness, diplomatic skill and strategic judgment needed to fully exploit that opportunity. If you read many histories of this period, you will see that the reign of Ivan III is often taken together with his son, Vasily III, as a single continuous period. Between them they ruled for 71 years, 43 for Ivan and 28 for Vasily. These 71 years make up the final part of this season of the podcast. Over the course of this period, Moscow becomes Russia. Through war, coercion, inheritance, negotiated submission, and annexation, the independence of Novgorod and the other Kняжества is ended. A collection of related but autonomous Rurikid city-states is transformed into a centralized monarchy. The court, administrative practices, political language, and institutions that will shape Russian government for centuries begin to take recognizable form. After marrying the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Ivan adopts the double-headed eagle as Russia's coat of arms. He calls himself the sovereign of all Rus, and, perhaps with his wife's influence, informally sometimes takes the title of Tsar. You will probably have heard of the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome, an idea that is also often cited as a factor in its rise. This story is not true either. While Bulgarian monks escaping from the Ottomans had brought the idea of a new Rome to Moscow, and Muscovite churchmen had started to talk about it during Ivan's reign. This idea did not find favour with Russia's rulers until much later, and was not a factor in Moscow's expansion. However, it was in this period that the Church really cemented its role as the defining factor in Rus identity, helped by the absence of competing forms of Christianity, as was the case in most of the rest of Europe. Vasily continues his father's expansion, bringing the last of the independent kняжества to heel, strengthening control over those already annexed, and also begins Moscow's move into the steppe, laying the foundations for the Russian Empire in his relations with the Tatars, and establishing approaches to colonial administration that also endure for centuries. It's slightly anachronistic, but from now on, I will start talking about Russians rather than Rus, as the collective noun for the people of the northeastern kняжества, as they become part of a single state. We are still before the times when our sources give us much idea of the personality of the ruler. Ivan grew up in the thick of the civil war, which must surely have had some effect on him. He was separated from his parents when his father was blinded and sent into exile in Uglitch. The men who had come for Vasily had ignored Ivan and his brother Yuri, which enabled some faithful retainers to spirit them away to the safekeeping of the Ryapolovsky family, staunch supporters of Vasily. From there they were sent to Murom on the lower Oka. The usurper, Dmitry Shemyaka, did not track them down until a couple of months later. By that point, Dmitry was already feeling as little love from the people of Moscow as his father had in the first phase of the civil war. He could not risk provoking further opposition by simply hunting the young knyazes down. Instead, he called on the Bishop of Ryazan, Iona, and asked him to take the children under his protection. If the bishop did this, Dmitry promised to release Vasily and grant the family an estate, as well as to make the bishop the next metropolitan. The bishop managed to persuade the Rapolovskys, who released the boys to him. But when they arrived in Pereyaslavl, Dmitry arrested them and imprisoned them with their father. Deceiving the bishop so soon after blinding the Grand Knyaz provoked greater opposition to Shemyaka in any case, with priests berating him in the churches and rumours of armies being gathered against him. He was forced to release them. He brought Vasily before him in public in Uglitch. Vasily was directed to admit that he was responsible for the sad state of affairs in Moscow, to declare that he deserved death, and to thank Shemyaka for allowing him to live and atone for his sins. He swore an oath to recognize Shemyaka as the Grand Knyaz, and was allowed to take his family to Vologda. Once he was on his way, Iona released Vasily from the oath granted under duress, and they went to join his supporters in Tver. The 6-year-old Ivan was betrothed to Boris of Tver's daughter, Maria. A year after being blinded, Vasily recovered Moscow. Our next news of young Ivan comes when he is 12. We find him as the nominal commander of a punitive army, pursuing Shemyaka across the north. The same year, he is married to Maria. 6 years after that, they have their first child, and Ivan has what was maybe his first independent military command. At least it is the only one mentioned in the chronicles before his father's death. Ivan is sent south with a large force to thwart a raid by Sayyid Ahmed and the Dnieper horde. He prevents the Tartars crossing the Oka and drives them off. The victory was considered significant enough that now Metropolitan Iona founds a new church in Moscow in celebration. And that is all we know of Ivan's childhood and youth. Around the time of this battle, he becomes co-ruler with his father, who is suffering from some kind of wasting disease. 2 years later, he becomes regent. Vasily II died in March 1462. The treatment for his wasting disease was applying smouldering coals to his body. The resulting burns festered, which caused him enormous pain, but more importantly prevented his final wish to be tonsured and take the oath of a monk from being carried out. This custom, which his predecessors had all followed, allowed rulers who had killed, lied, and cheated as required by their office to repent and be released from their sins before death. Refusing it must have increased his suffering even more. In his last days, he wrote a will. The will clearly established Ivan's predominance over his brothers. Ivan was given the Grand Knyazhestvo and 1/3 of all the revenue from the city of Moscow. Of the 27 other cities that Moscow ruled, or at least claimed to rule, Ivan was granted 15, although Vyatka, which had submitted to Vasily 3 years earlier, was to all practical purposes still independent. The other 2/3 of Moscow's revenue and 12 cities were apportioned to Vasily's widow and Ivan's brothers. Yuri, the eldest, received Dmitrov, Serpukhov, Khatun, Medin, and Mazhaisk. Andrei the elder received Uglich, Biezhetsky Vyakh, and Zvenigorod. Boris received the western lands bordering Lithuania, Volokholamsk, Rzhev, and Ruza, while Andrei the younger received Vologda and Bielozero. All of them were commanded to respect their mother, Grand Knягina Maria, who received villages and estates in all of their domains. Maria was also given overlordship of Rostov, which, like Vyatka, was still effectively independent. Vasily made no mention of the appanages given to other members of the family. Historians have debated whether this omission was intentional, but, as we shall see, it was certainly important. Vasily instructed Ivan to treat his brothers in a brotherly fashion and not cause them offence, and the brothers to respect and obey their elder brother in place of their father. He ended the will by commending his widow and sons to the care of his brother, the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, Kazimierz, according to the Treaty of Friendship that they had signed in 1449. As we shall see, neither Ivan nor Kazimierz takes much notice of this. We can only guess what Vasily hoped for his son. Maybe he simply hoped that they would enjoy peace and prosperity after the civil wars that had taken up so much of his reign. It's unlikely that he foresaw how successful Ivan would be. Thank you for listening, and until next time, bye.